The public is conditioned to fear the missile launch. The media fixates on hypersonic platforms and nuclear payloads. This is a kinetic misdirection. The primary vector for systemic collapse is not a mushroom cloud. It is absolute silence. CSIS reports detail the fragility of the global nervous system. The undersea fiber optic cables that carry 99% of all intercontinental data and trillions in daily financial transactions. A coordinated, unattributable attack on a few key choke points would not cripple the system. It would liquidate it. 8. Simultaneously, RUSI analysts model a dazzling protocol against low Earth orbit constellations, blinding the orbital assets that provide GPS, ISR, and secure communications. The result is not chaos. It is a calculated paralysis. This is the blueprint for creating a blind Leviathan. A Western military apparatus with unmatched kinetic power, but zero visibility. A multi-trillion-dollar war machine, deaf and disoriented. Its launch-on-warning protocols transform from a deterrent into a systemic liability, a hair-trigger mechanism for accidental and terminal escalation. To understand the motive, you must discard the narrative of ideology. This is a solvency crisis. For the Russian Federation, the kinetic cost of the war and the drain on its domestic economy have created a severe internal liability. Analysts at CSIS confirm the conflict is a significant drain, creating pressure for a decisive outcome to justify the expenditure. When a state's solvency is threatened, its strategic calculus defaults to survival, not popular opinion. It is a mathematical equation of power projection versus internal collapse. Simultaneously, the West's economic warfare has become a vector for its own industrial decay. This is not a miscalculation. It is the observable result of the strategy. In Germany, the industrial engine of Europe, Chancellor Friedrich Merz himself now warns of a severe economic crisis, a direct consequence of severing low-cost Russian energy inputs. Yet the policy remains locked in place. This self-inflicted degradation of Allied economic solvency is the critical vulnerability. This dual solvency crisis creates the pivot. When conventional military options become too expensive, when the kinetic cost exceeds the state's ability to pay, a weaker actor is mathematically forced to adopt asymmetric protocols. The goal shifts from battlefield victory to inflicting maximum economic or social disruption on the adversary at the lowest possible cost. Weakness does not compel surrender. It compels innovation in unconventional warfare. This is the primary accelerant of systemic risk. Asymmetric attacks on critical infrastructure, power grids, financial networks, pipelines blur the threshold for escalation. They erode deterrence protocols and create a launch-on-warning environment. A cyber attack that shuts down a nation's banking system can be perceived as an existential threat, demanding a kinetic response. The failed economic strategy does not simply end. It transforms into a direct pathway to miscalculation and open confrontation. The core of the strategic miscalculation is a failure to grasp the new economics of lethality. A definitive report from the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, quantifies the disparity. A $5 million main battle tank, the symbol of 20th century land power, is now a confirmed kinetic liability, neutralized by a $500 first-person view drone. This is not a simple cost-benefit analysis. It is an economic inversion. The legacy asset, representing decades of industrial investment, is systematically liquidated by a disposable consumer product. The financial model of conventional warfare has been rendered insolvent. This radical cost asymmetry creates a condition analysts label the democratization of violence. The capability to project decisive force is no longer the exclusive domain of states with massive industrial bases and colossal defense budgets. It has been decentralized. The barrier to entry for destroying high-value military hardware has collapsed to near zero. This transfers leverage from capital-intensive state actors to agile, non-state or proxy forces. The West's doctrine is anchored to platforms that are now liabilities on a battlefield, where its adversaries have achieved near-infinite low-cost scalability. This economic reality is the primary accelerant of systemic risk. While the West litigates its own industrial decay and financial solvency crisis to sustain a proxy conflict using obsolete cost structures, it creates a power vacuum. When the economic model for conventional superiority fails, and your adversary can achieve kinetic parity for a fraction of the cost, the strategic calculus is forced to escalate. The reliance on legacy platforms becomes a vector for failure, mathematically inviting a shift toward the only asymmetric leverage that remains. This transforms a failed economic strategy into a direct pathway to a launch-on-warning protocol. The failure of Western economic warfare is not a theoretical model. It has a physical location. While financial media focuses on the proxy conflict itself, the true battle space is emerging where Western economic solvency is collapsing. In Germany, the industrial engine of Europe. Chancellor Merz warns of a severe economic crisis while simultaneously doubling down on the central planning that caused it. This self-inflicted industrial decay is not a side effect. It is the strategic ground being ceded to adversaries. This economic vacuum creates the gray zone, destabilized regions that function as proxy laboratories for hostile actors. The financial fuel for these operations is provided directly by the failure of the sanctions regime. While Germany deindustrializes, India has imported $168 billion in Russian oil, rendering the economic blockade fiscally irrelevant. This liquidity does not vanish. It is reinvested. CSIS reports indicate these funds are now used to weaponize instability in politically fragile Western-aligned states. Do not misinterpret events in places like Canada or South Africa as isolated domestic crises. From a strategic perspective, they are staging grounds. According to RUSI analysts, these zones are used to test asymmetric attack vectors, supply chain disruption, infrastructure sabotage, political polarization, at a low kinetic cost. Each successful operation provides a blueprint for deployment inside the core Western powers. This is not rebellion, it is reconnaissance in force, executed on the economic plane. The mathematical certainty is this: a power with a degrading economic base cannot sustain global force projection. By sacrificing its own industrial solvency, the West has created a low-risk, high-reward environment for its rivals. The gray zone is the incubator. The failure of economic warfare is the accelerant. The inevitable outcome is the migration of these tested asymmetric threats from the periphery to the homeland, transforming a policy blunder into a direct vector for kinetic confrontation. The launch-on-warning doctrine is not a policy of aggression, it is a mathematical protocol of survival. The logic is zero-sum. If an adversary launches a first strike, their missiles must be detected mid-flight to allow for a retaliatory launch. Before your own arsenal is destroyed on the ground. This guarantees mutual destruction and, in theory, prevents the first strike from ever occurring. The entire architecture of deterrence rests on the integrity of this warning system. This doctrine's fatal flaw, as outlined in CSES threat models, is its reliance on data. A kinetic attack on a radar installation is verifiable. A cyber attack, however, creates a phantom. It can blind the system entirely, or worse, inject false positives. Ghost missiles appearing on screens that are indistinguishable from reality. This is the fog of digital war, a state of manufactured uncertainty where data becomes a weapon against its owner. In this scenario, the commander is systemically trapped. The protocol has no variable for maybe. The decision window is minutes. If the radar is blind, is it a system failure or is it a deliberate blinding attack preceding kinetic impact? The doctrine forces the commander to default to the worst-case assumption, because the kinetic cost of being wrong, of failing to launch against a real attack, is the complete loss of strategic solvency. Fear becomes the trigger mechanism. The commander is no longer responding to an enemy missile, but to the fear of an enemy missile in a data vacuum. RUSI reports confirm this is a primary vector for asymmetric escalation. An adversary doesn't need to build a billion-dollar missile. They only need to create the digital ghost of one. This transforms a nation's own defense doctrine into the very accelerant of its destruction. The strategic equation is now inverted. Western policy has engineered a systemic solvency crisis. As Germany's industrial base decays, a liability acknowledged by its own leadership, Allied states like India inject over $168 billion into the Russian economy, negating the sanctions protocol entirely. This is not a policy failure. It is a deliberate degradation of the West's own economic leverage, creating a power vacuum. This vacuum will not remain empty. According to risk models from RUSI and CSIS, a direct kinetic confrontation is currently too costly for all primary actors. The next phase is therefore asymmetric, a test of the system's fragility, a calibration shot designed for plausible deniability but catastrophic economic effect. Within the next 12 months, anticipate a coordinated attribution impossible cyber event targeting the transatlantic logistics network. Specifically, a simultaneous blackout of 3 key European and North American container port processing systems and the fiber optic landing stations that service them. The kinetic cost will be zero. The economic cost will be a systemic liquidity seizure. This is not an act of war. It is a message sent through the vector of infrastructure collapse, demonstrating that the West's capacity to absorb economic shock has been fatally compromised. It is a launch-on warning signal for the financial system.